The U.S. elite and the U.S. masses. The Constitution's elite. When the delegates assembled for the new Constitutional Convention, it was a group of 55 white, propertied, rich men. They came from 12 of the states. Rhode Island did not participate by choice. And they came to made some pretty immediate decisions. You'll remember that we're right on the heels of a very worrisome rebellion, and so they had to get things started quickly. The first three things that they decided was, number one, they would put George Washington in charge. He was pretty much the most powerful man on the continent, so he would preside over all of the activities that were going to go on there. Secondly, they decided that the meetings that they were going to have were going to be closed-door secret sessions. No one could come in without an invitation. You had to be one of the specific delegates who was there, and you couldn't go home and share news with anybody. Not even friends or family could be privy to these sessions or what went on in them. And lastly, they decided that instead of reforming the Articles of Confederation, as originally they had thought to come together to do, they would just scrap them and start from scratch with the brand new Constitution. As I mentioned, George Washington was to be the head of the delegates. George Washington commanded a lot of respect in that day. He was a Revolutionary War general, and he actually was so wealthy that he paid his own soldiers from his personal fortune. So while the rest of the war was financed differently, his soldiers were actually paid much better, and they were paid from his fortune. So he had some very, very loyal soldiers who followed him, and some of them who actually were from families of delegates who came to this meeting. He was actually probably the richest guy there. He owned just tons of acreage in several different states, and he owned major shares in some very large companies at the time, including the Potomac Company and the James River Company. He also owned shares in two large banks, the Bank of Columbia and the Bank of Alexandria. And he held large amounts in U.S. bonds and securities. He also was about 6'2", so if you can imagine, he was quite imposing, especially for that time period. And he was just one of those guys that when he walked in the room, he commanded a lot of respect. Everybody knew him, and he was an easy choice for heading up the delegation. Robert Morris was also there. Robert Morris was known as the Patriot Financier. The reason for this is because he, too, was quite wealthy. He was one of the foremost business and financial leaders in the kingdom of that time. In the nation at that time. And he owned just a lot of ships that did a lot of trading all over the world. He was into iron manufacturing and land speculating. But really where the vast majority of his wealth came from was from his work in the banking and finance industry. He controlled the biggest bank in the country at the time, which was the Bank of North America in Philadelphia. And he actually was so wealthy that he personally underwrote a large share of the U.S. debt during and after the Revolutionary War. So you'll remember me saying that we kind of got this national debt and we didn't have any way to repay it because we had no way to federally tax. Well, who were we borrowing that money from? We were borrowing it from folks like Robert Morris. The Founding Fathers, these 55 propertied white males who got together, really had a lot of in common, but three things that we can pull out and talk about today. One is that they had extensive experience in governing. Secondly, they had impressive educational attainment. And thirdly, they were wealthy beyond compare. A lot of the men had just an overwhelming amount of governmental experience for the time. They had made a lot of the key decisions in America's short history up to this point. So the Stamp Act, Congress, the Declaration of Independence, and the Articles of Confederation, quite a few of these folks had their hands in these, and if you look at the signatures of a lot of these documents, you'll see a lot of names repeated. They also participated heavily in Congress. 42 of 55 of them had already served in Congress. And they had orchestrated the Revolutionary War. They weren't pretty much on the front lines, but they did have quite a bit to say in the strategy of the war and really working at it from behind the scenes. 11 of them were Washington's officers. Eight of them signed the Declaration of Independence, and over 40 of them held high state offices within their own state governments. 3 of them were actually the governors from the states where they came. All of them were impressively educated. More than half of them were educated at big-name universities: Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, UPenn, Columbia College, Princeton, or over in England in their foremost universities over there. About 12 of them were active lawyers, and 36 were not lawyers but actually had legal training. They just weren't formally certified as active lawyers. And this is pretty impressive for today, if you were to gather a group of 55 individuals together. But at this point in history, no more than a handful of men on the whole continent had gone to college at all. And so we're really looking at taking the only educated people on this part of the country, or in the whole country at this time, and putting them together in this room. And lastly, they were wealthy beyond compare. 40 out of the 55 were holders of government bonds. 14 were land speculators. As I mentioned before, that's when they go out and would buy up land that maybe was foreclosing or that people couldn't really afford to keep anymore. They'd buy it cheap and then resell it. We had 24 of them who were money lenders and investors, 11 who were in commerce and manufacturing, and 15 who owned their own large plantations. This is a table of the Founding Fathers' known memberships in elite groups. This is actually from the book The Irony of Democracy, written by Diane Ziegler. And if you're interested in the history of the Founding Fathers and what went on with them, kind of in what we've been speaking of, that's a great book for you to read up on. It's very accessible, and it's got great tables like this one. One thing I want to point out in these tables, so what this is the Founding Fathers divided up by the industries that they were involved in. So some were holders of public securities, some were real estate and land speculators, some were lenders and investors, some were merchants, manufacturers and shippers, and some were planters and slaveholders. One interesting thing to notice is that the names are repeated often in a lot of the columns. For example, the Founding Father whose last name is Fitzsimmons, you'll see his name in every column except for the holders of public security interests minor. And that's because he is in the column for holders of public security interests major. So he really had his wealth spread around these different industries. Oh, actually, no, it looks like he wasn't a planter, but he had the rest of them. And you'll have several other names you'll see repeated throughout the table here. So the reason it looks like more than 55 names is because it is. It's because they're repeated in several different parts of the table. You'll see Randolph is in about 3 of them. He's a lender and investor, holder of public securities major, and planter and slaveholder. And there are a lot of other examples here too. Another thing to notice is that there's examples of what we spoke about earlier about the relationships between some of these individuals. You'll see the Pinckney father and son, C. Pinckney and C.C. Pinckney were father and son, and they are here represented in the table in quite a few categories. And there are a couple more in here. There are 2 different Morrises who are actually uncle and nephew who are here, and other ones who don't share the same last name but who are still kin and were related in some way. And so we had these folks come together and begin the draft of our Constitution. This is a cartoon where Mr. Obama is reading. It says, "Mr. Madison, I detected a flaw in your Constitution. Nothing in it allows the government to confiscate wealth for redistribution." And Mr. Madison is sitting in the corner and he says, "That's not a flaw, sir, that's the point." And so we come to the potential contradiction of democracy, which is that government by majority rule can threaten the life, liberty, and property of minorities and individuals. And this is exactly what we were talking about with the elite fear of leveling and why coming together to create a government with stronger national powers in a new constitution was going to be so important. To what was said by Jeremy Belknap, they really understood the idea that even if democracy was something which they found a little bit unpalatable, the idea that letting it stand as a principle that the government originates from the people was something that they felt they had to preserve. They had to let the people understand and feel like they were governing themselves, even though, as Mr. Belknap stated, that the people should be taught that they are not able to govern themselves. And so, in addition to Madison and Randolph and Gerry, they began again to discuss how they were going to take this concept of democracy, have the people understand or feel like they're in control of what's going on in governance, however, still protecting the different and unequal faculties of acquiring property and doing what they could to protect their life, liberty, and property as they saw it. And so with that, they began the draft of the new Constitution.